finally got a foundation that matches my skin tone. Are you proud of me? You can stop commenting about it. To be fair, I laughed at them, so it's fine. Back in 2019, I think it was August or September, I did an LGBT discourse video where I just kind of spit out the thoughts on all of the discourses, the big ones in the community, just so people would know where I stand on them, so I didn't keep getting asked. And one of the things that came up that I actually thought was a valid counterpoint, there were some bisexual folks angry at the definitions that I gave for pan, poly, omni, and bi. There is a sect of bisexuals that asserts that the definition of bisexual has evolved to mean more than its root word. And I respect that. Let me just put that out there right now. The main point of that video in general, the main theme that continuously popped up in that video was mind your own fucking business, right? So even after those definitions were said, even if you as a bisexual person were like, that's not how I see it, I would have respected it anyways. So you can unclench. I just thought this was a good opportunity because I've been delving much further into queer theory lately. And I thought this was a good opportunity to open up more conversations and have a good time, you know? Because, hey, guys, sexuality and gender are nuanced and fluid, and it is so difficult to deal with these themes in such a rigid and defined way. So let's talk about that. One of the things I actually want to mention before we even get into like bisexuality, I could have sworn that I put this disclaimer in there, but I did not. Pansexuality is not necessarily sexual attraction to personalities. It manifests that way for me, but technically it means like gender is not a factor in attraction. So, I mean, personalities can be your factor in attraction, but I guess it could be other things too. I wanted to make that clear because I did not put that disclaimer in there. As you can tell, I am talking on very deep subjects while half asleep, and I'm also editing half asleep. I'm always half asleep. Let that be known. So here's the fucking thing. This topic is very complicated. I have very conflicting feelings about this topic because there are so many different aspects to it, which is why in the end of the day, it's just like mind your own business. Like that's kind of where I am leaning towards here because it is so fucking complicated. So the definitions in that video for pan, poly, omni, bi, right, were root definitions, I like to call them. They were basic definitions based on the root word, right? And that's how I differentiate between the four of them. Well, pan is kind of like a different type of attraction altogether, just like demisexual is a different type of non-attraction altogether. So really we'll be discussing the difference between bi, poly, omni, I suppose. All of these sexualities will manifest differently for each and every person. And that's why this conversation is so difficult to have, because technically gender and sexuality is nuanced and different for each and every individual, and we are using a handful of labels to describe 7.8 billion people. Of course that was going to blow up in our faces, guys. We're trying to use a handful of labels to describe 7.8 billion different individual sexualities. It wasn't gonna work out. Of course we were gonna fight about this. Of course micro labels were going to happen. Now this is not really like an anti-label agenda, because I do understand that labels make people feel like they know themselves better, like they're part of a community. Labels are attached to cultures, like lesbians have their own culture, basically, with all of their, you know, subcultures inside. Getting into queer theory is so interesting because you are exposed to so many different types of microcultures. But it's also important to note that the comfort that labels give us was going to come at a price. And that price would be fighting over what these labels mean. And in the end, as long as you are not putting another group in danger or disrespecting a label, I don't care. If you're bi, don't identify as a lesbian. Like, you're putting lesbians in danger. You're making men think that lesbians are available to them. Just don't. Don't do that shit, right? If you're putting other people in danger or you're hurting a group of people, don't do it. However, otherwise, it's a mind your own fucking business kind of thing. On one end, right, these multi-sexual labels are different for everyone that uses them. And you will see the chaos in these definitions when you try to look up what they mean, because you will find 5 different definitions for the same goddamn label. And like I said, that was bound to happen. It was gonna happen. There was no way to avoid that. So on one end, right, if you are a bisexual person that does in fact like more than 2 genders, that's okay. I don't blame you. I'm not angry at you or think that you are a fake bisexual. I promise. I say mind my own fucking business about these things, and I live by that. So just vibe, okay? There's that part of the argument, right? There's that overwhelming part of the argument that I will always end up going back to. But then there's this little part of me, you know, the little gremlin, the little devil's advocate that I like to kill because I don't like it. And that little devil inside me usually comes out when I see certain bisexual people forcing their definition of bisexuality onto other bisexual people and onto the community. It is okay for you to have your own personal definition of bisexuality because everyone's sexuality is individualized and nuanced, but forcing your own individual label onto, first of all, other bisexuals, and then onto the community, you're invalidating other bisexuals, first of all, and second of all, you're invalidating other micro-labels that have popped up because they didn't feel that bisexuality fit the bill, Latin, Greek, root-wise. And an example of this, right, I've seen hot takes where it was like, bisexuality has always meant attraction to all genders. We're going to take it back. Okay, interesting hot take. If it means attraction to all genders to you, that's fine. I have no quandaries with that. The problem here is that you are kind of like asserting that across the community. And that assertion of bisexuality means attraction to all genders completely invalidates omnisexual. Just completely invalidates it. And a lot of the time, when bisexual people assert that bisexuality has always meant 2 or more genders, I'm gonna need you to slow your roll, because every single time y'all do that, you're also invalidating polysexual. And there's like the tired part of me that's like, I guess it doesn't matter, they all overlap, whatever. But there's the other part of me that's like, then it's not logical for those labels to exist if bisexuality and people that are bisexual are just going to invalidate those labels by asserting their own definition of bisexuality onto those labels. That same logic is why I get kind of uncomfortable with that one picture. I'll find it. Maybe individually your own definition might overlap with another sexuality, but like the base definition, no, they do not overlap. They're different. That's why they exist, because they're different from each other. There is literally no reason for these labels to exist if they are not different from each other. So it's kind of complicated. Because on one end, if a I've seen this before, someone's like, pansexuality means this, and a person was like, well, I'm bisexual and I feel that way. And in my head, I was like, I know you're attempting to invalidate pansexuality, but like, it's really okay for you to identify as bisexual with a pansexual definition. It doesn't really hurt anyone too much. And I also understand why a lot of the multisexual community shifts towards bisexual, or the bisexual label, because it is a more widespread label. People immediately understand it. You don't have to explain yourself when you say you're bisexual. It's almost like why the entire community sort of is like, I'm gay, when we're not all gay, technically. The label back in the day was probably the most known queer label, so the entire community kind of had to adopt it, unfortunately, to the chagrin of queer men, but it was like the only label that people understood, so hence why the entire community had to adopt it. And I think the same thing is sort of happening with bisexuality, which, I mean, obviously valid. I'm not, like, upset by it. Your own individual sexuality is your own individual sexuality, and I'm not going to infringe upon that because it's really not my business. Like I've said before, I only start to really care when people start asserting their own definition. Like, imagine if I asserted that pansexuality, like just forced it upon everyone that pansexuality means attraction to personalities. Imagine if I just forced that upon other pansexual people and just the entire community. That would suck because, first of all, that doesn't take into account other pansexuals. And I don't think the bisexuals that do this realize that they're also kind of asserting themselves upon other bisexual people too. There are actually some bisexual people that do go by the 2 genders definition. And there are some bisexual people that like 3 genders, and there are some bisexual people that like 4 genders, and some bisexual people that like indefinite amount of genders. Imagine if one of these that I just said was just asserting themselves upon all these other bisexual people. It just kind of, stop. Just don't do that. You need to recognize that these labels, while they do make people feel comfortable, they help people find themselves, being extremely rigid with these definitions and forcing your own interpretation onto other people of your group, it's not going to work out with such a nuanced, individualized conversation that we are having right now. And to be fair, the definitions I give in that video are what I say when people ask what the difference is. Because I'm not just gonna go, oh, there's no difference. All these micro labels have no purpose. Because that's invalidating, and it's also not true to where those micro labels came from. So I do just kind of go 2, 3 or more, all but different, just to give the general overview of why there are different labels for these sexualities. But in the end, I will always preface that just pick the label that makes you feel the most comfortable, I guess. It's kind of like a weird multi-layered conversation, because on one end, you don't want to invalidate these other micro-labels, but on the other hand, these labels don't really span the complexity of sexuality, and it was gonna get weird at some point. And you just gotta accept that people are going to identify a certain way despite its base definition, and that's okay. And another part of this, the bisexual people that are like asserting the bisexuality has always meant all genders agenda, that almost in a weird way invalidates non-binary genders. Like, I understand non-binary genders that are more aligned one way or the other, but like someone that identifies solely as non-binary, that is their own specific gender, and we should treat it like it's own specific gender. Coddling people that identify solely as non-binary, saying that everybody's sexualities includes them, is almost more transphobic than like acknowledging that non-binary genders that solely identify as non-binary, not man-aligned or woman-aligned, it gets complicated. Treating them like they are in fact a gender and not some like special case, you know? If they're a gender, then they should be treated like other genders. You know how people can like women and not like men? Why would that be different for a non-binary gender if they're a gender? That's kind of where I'm like, hey, that doesn't make sense. That notion that there is no in-between between liking one gender and liking all genders. Come on, guys. There's got to be like some in between. We're doing the 1 or 100 fallacy right now. Let's just like, let's think about it critically. Whether or not you identify with the base definitions, I don't give a shit about, because I acknowledge the complexity of this situation. But we should also acknowledge the base definitions as to not invalidate the other micro labels that have popped up. It's a complicated topic. Yeah, queer theory is exhausting because none of this makes sense, and yeah, that's just how human identity works. It doesn't make sense.